American Airlines is the biggest airliner in the world, and it has held that title since the year 1936, and it is still the biggest to this day. In the beginning of the 1970s, American Airlines is trying to make a deal with McDonnell Douglas or Boeing to buy an airplane for long distance travel. The Boeing has the very famous 747 coming out soon, and McDonnell Douglas has a new airplane which is not as big, but it's meant for long distances, called the DC-10.
As a 747, but able to land at almost any commercial airport. Introducing the new DC-10 luxury liner with a lounge and coach and first class.
Right here, American Airlines makes a huge mistake because they buy the DC-10 as their main long travel plane. In the year 1972, one of the first DC-10s was working, and it was being used as a cargo airplane. In one of these flights, the rear door of the DC-10 rips out, but luckily nothing bad happens, and the pilot can bring the plane down and land it carefully without anyone being hurt. But unfortunately, only 2 years later, the people on Turkish Airlines weren't so lucky. 330 people were on board, and the Turkish Airlines DC-10 takes off to go to London. Only a few minutes after takeoff, the rear piece of the DC-10 rips out, which basically makes the airplane convertible. And the pressure change was so insane that the pilots couldn't control the airplane whatsoever, and it just took a nosedive all the way down, smashing into the ground, killing all 335 people on board. DC-10 has barely entered the market of airliners, and it has already had 2 insane incidents. When you fast forward 5 years later, on the 25th of May 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago is getting ready to take off. This airplane has 271 souls on board, and since it's going to Los Angeles, it has damn near a full tank of fuel, so you can't say it's empty. The main captain was 53-year-old Walter Lux, co-pilot was 49-year-old James Dillard, and the flight engineer was 56-year-old Alfred Yudovich. So the cockpit was extremely experienced with tens of thousands of hours of experience. They were getting ready, and at 3:04 p.m., the control tower gives them the green light to go ahead and take off. Pilot Dillard takes the plane to the runway and pretty much goes full throttle to take off. The speed of the aircraft reaches 250 kilometers an hour, also known as V1. When an aircraft reaches V1 speed, it basically cannot abort mission. It has to take off. There is no more room to slow down anymore. So that's why the pilot lifted up the nose to take off. The airplane takes off, but all of a sudden, a huge bam is heard in the cockpit. And the control tower has the recording of one of the pilots saying, "Damn." After the "damn" is said, the control tower cannot hear the airplane anymore. Because this DC-10 has completely lost electricity and they don't know what's happening. One of the employees of the control tower hears the damn and immediately looks at the runway to see what the DC-10 is doing. And this is the situation he sees. There are even photographers around that area that take photos like this. But why is the airplane tilted like that? Because while the airplane took off, the left engine literally got ripped off. And since the pilots did not know what has happened, they didn't know how to properly control it. And since they didn't understand what's happening, the airplane was tilted 90 degrees to the side. And when the control tower saw a situation like this, they were hopeless. They knew the airplane was gonna go down. So they immediately hit the emergency button for the firefighters and the ambulances to show up immediately around the explosion. An airplane that looks like a bomb. More than 270 people on board, damn near full with jet fuel, and it's going down and it's gonna go down hard. The airplane comes down hard and it hit one of the warehouses that the auto mechanics used to work at. The explosion was so massive that people from the other side of Chicago heard it. Since it was the afternoon, in this warehouse there were only 2 employees working. But because of the impact and the fire, both of these employees died. But out of the aircraft, not a single soul survived either. All 271 people had died and their bodies had burned. It is interesting to know that next to this airport there's an oil refinery, and when this explosion happened and they saw the fireball, a lot of people, including the fire department, thought the refinery had exploded. So they got to that area and realized no, it happened inside the airport, and they very quickly realized that it was an aircraft that exploded. This incident is known as the biggest airplane crash in US history. After this accident took place, experts came to see what had happened because it was extremely weird for an airplane to take off and a few seconds later come crashing down. They knew one of the engines had ripped off before the accident, but they wanted to know why. Something like this had never happened before. What is McDonnell Douglas thinking? They released an airplane that wants to compete with the 747, but they already had 3 insane incidences and hundreds of people died. This is when the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, announced that all DC-10s have to be grounded until we figure out what has happened. Even though the FAA was an American administration, a lot of overseas airliners listened to this and they grounded their DC-10s as well to wait until something has happened, because the news of this accident was that big around the world. The more the experts tried to figure out why the engine ripped out, they really couldn't, until they looked at the maintenance records. They realized that 2 months ago in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the same airplane had some work done to it and it had the left engine replaced. And this is when the experts realized what has happened. The technicians that worked on this aircraft, instead of just removing the jet engine alone, they pretty much removed the engine mount with the jet engine together. And they put the engine brace on the new jet engine and connect them to the wings together. This is not the correct procedure to replace a jet engine on a DC-10 because things could not line up correctly, and things like this have to be extremely precise because you're not joking around. This is not a bicycle. Not only wasn't it bolted down correctly, it was actually loose as well. This is what separates a responsible person and an irresponsible person. One irresponsibility could cause hundreds of people to die in a split second. When experts looked at other DC-10 maintenance records, they realized, wow, a lot of technicians around the country are doing the same procedure to replace jet engines. It's basically because it's quicker to do it this way, but it's not the correct way. They examined other DC-10s and realized that there are minor cracks on these braces. So if these DC-10s continue to fly, the same exact incident would happen. After this incident, the FAA put the blame on the technicians of American Airlines, and the airliner was fined $500,000 for this. But this was just the fine that the FAA put on them. You have to know that any airplane that wants to lift off, before any liftoff, it has to be fully inspected. After everything is gone through and no issues has been found, the airplane is good to go for takeoff. The technician that inspected American Airlines Flight 191 was a gentleman named Earl Russell. And unfortunately, after hearing this news, a few months after, he took his own life. Even though he wasn't the main person at fault, because there's no way you could have seen those cracks unless you took apart the engine, and it was actually the technician's fault. Every DC-10 was inspected, and that problem was pretty much solved. So the DC-10 was allowed to fly once again, and it hasn't had an incident ever since. After the year 2000, American Airlines stopped using the DC-10 for more modern, better aircrafts. But that doesn't mean that the DC-10 is not being used. There are airlines, including FedEx, that still use this aircraft to this day. And thankfully, nothing bad has taken place. It is interesting to note that this accident is a teaching point to technicians and engineers that want to get into the aircraft world. With this incident, they teach men and women, if you are irresponsible, things like this will happen. So people's lives are literally in your hands. The date is March 24th, 2015, and flight number 9525 Germanwings is flying an Airbus A320, and it's flying from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, Germany. This is when the control tower realizes that the pilot has turned down the elevation of the plane from 38,000 feet to 100 feet. In the control tower, they were very shocked because they had never seen such a thing go from 38,000 to 100 feet real quick, because that's the minimum it could go. Of course, after seeing this, the control tower contacts the pilot to get a message through and see what is going on, but nobody seems to answer. The airplane continues to descend and nobody is answering the tower. There was 150 passengers inside the aircraft, and that worried them even more. This is when they call the French military, and they immediately send the Mirage fighter jet to see what is happening. But the Mirage never reaches its destination because the Germanwings flight 9525 had already crashed in the southeastern part of France, where it's very mountainous, and all 150 passengers were immediately killed. We first have to say, Germanwings was part of the Lufthansa group, which is no longer around, but during the time of this accident, they were very well and alive. From start to finish, it was extremely sketchy what had happened in this accident. Or was it really an accident? Since it happened in France and it was a German plane and it started from Spain, different countries started to investigate on what happened. After doing a lot of research and reading the black box, this is the conclusion they came up with. 8 in the morning, when this Airbus A320 was getting ready, everything was going well and it was just getting fueled up and inspected. Everything gets approved, and the main captain of the plane is this man, Patrick Sondenheimer, a very experienced pilot that has more than 6,000 hours in flight time. But his first officer or co-pilot was not so experienced. He was only 28 years old and 650 hours of experience. A man named Andreas Lubitz. Eventually, 9 AM sharp, they lift off from Barcelona. After 27 minutes, the airplane has reached 38,000 feet. At this moment, it's only an hour and a half until Dusseldorf, and this is when the main pilot tells Lubitz to check what Dusseldorf's weather is like so we can get ready for the landing. But Andreas Lubitz gives a very odd response to this question. He says hopefully we'll see, which is very weird in this situation, but Sondenheimer wasn't really paying attention, it seems like, because he didn't even think about it. After this, Sondenheimer tells Lubitz that he's gonna take a quick bathroom break, and I put the airplane on autopilot. As soon as Sondenheimer leaves the cabin, Lubitz locks the doors and turns the knob from 38,000 feet all the way down to 100. This is exactly when the control tower realizes that this is happening, and they try to alert on what is happening. But unfortunately, the only person inside the cabin is Lubitz, and the only person that could hear the warning coming from the tower is Lubitz himself. You have to know, when the cabin door is locked, you cannot do anything to enter it. You can't even use a machine gun to open it. And at this moment, the only people that know that this airplane is going down is Lubitz himself and the control tower. The control tower even has reported that they could hear Lubitz breathing into the microphone, but he's not speaking. Sondenheimer's bathroom break doesn't even take a minute. He quickly gets back to the cabin, but he realizes that the door is locked. He gets confused in the beginning and keeps on knocking, but there's no answer. And after a while, he begins to freak out. He thought something had happened to Lubitz. The airplane continues to descend, and the people haven't realized it yet. Sondenheimer is extremely worried. He takes a glance out the window and he realizes that they're getting very close to the ground, and he comes to the conclusion that he's trying to crash the plane. He freaks out even harder. Inside the safety compartments of the aircraft, there are these types of acts. He tells one of the flight attendants to go grab it, so maybe he can get the door open. But unfortunately, there's no way to open the door. You can't even do it with a machine gun, let alone this axe. 11 minutes after Lubitz locking the door, meaning 9:41 a.m., the A320 hits the side of the mountain, and 150 people, kids included, get killed because of Lubitz. When this A320 hit the mountain, it was going 700 kilometers an hour, so there was pretty much nothing left. It was all debris, and the biggest pieces were smaller than a car. Since the accident took place, they immediately tell the rescue team of France, and they went there with a few helicopters. But before they even got there, they saw the debris and realized there's no one there to save. They very quickly also realized that this plane was hit on the side of the mountain on purpose, because there's no try in fixing it, changing direction, or pulling up. But they weren't the one that could decide that. So the investigation started by all types of countries, especially Spain, Germany, England, and the United States. After investigating for months, they reported that Lubitz hit this aircraft on the side of the mountain on purpose. But why is that? The number one responsibility for any pilot is the safety of the passengers. How can you kill everybody on board on purpose? Who was Andreas Lubitz? In the year 1987, he was born in Bavaria, and he was a very normal kid that loved aircrafts. When they asked his loved ones and friends, they would say he was a good kid. The only problem was that he would never stop talking about airplanes, but I didn't see anything wrong with him. Lubitz was only 20 years old when he entered Lufthansa's flight school, which is very young for someone to do this. Usually they're much older than 20. And eventually in the year 2013, Lubitz was only 26 years old and he got hired as a co-pilot for Germanwings. And this is another thing you rarely see, a 26-year-old co-pilot. But Lubitz worked hard and he showed that he was able to do it. Until now, Lubitz is a very normal human, but why would he do such a thing in only 1 year? It was all going well until they searched his apartment. They very quickly realized that Lubitz was keeping a secret from everybody, an extremely dark secret. He had all types of mental illnesses and anxiety disorders, things that they wouldn't even allow you to drive a taxi, let alone an aircraft with more than 150 passengers. When they look at his medical records, they see that he went to the doctor constantly, but he would go to private doctors that wouldn't report his illnesses to anyone. If he would go to a normal doctor, every type of diagnosis or sickness that he was diagnosed, they would have to report it to his employer, which was Lufthansa, and that meant losing his job. And he didn't want that, so he would exclusively work with doctors that wouldn't do this. They realized that Lubitz thought he's losing his vision. Even though the doctors would say you have no trouble with your vision, it's just your thoughts. We have to fix your mental illness, not your eyes. But Lubitz would not listen. He was prescribed a whole lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, but he would still have these thoughts. And of course, if you have these types of medications, you're not supposed to be anywhere near an aircraft cabin. But he was. And Lufthansa has no idea this is happening. A 20-year-old man that's very physically capable, he's talented in the aircraft department, but his mind has paralyzed him. When they search his history, they realize that he constantly searched Google on how to unalive himself. Of course, Google does not give any response to such question. They just tell you to call this number if you need any help. You really can't call this depression, because no one depressed decides to kill 149 other people with himself. This is why different doctors would diagnose him as sadistic and psychosis, not just depression. Lufthansa didn't really help out the people that suffered because they were only given 75,000 euros each. The IATA also put rules aside that every single pilot has to go through a physical exam once a year and also a mental health check. They also put another rule, and that's there can never be only one person inside the cabin. So if one of the pilot or the co-pilot wants to go to the bathroom, a flight attendant has to come inside the cabin and wait. and this means one person can never be inside the cabin ever again. At the end of the 1960s, Boeing introduced an aircraft that pretty much changed the world of passenger airplanes. The Boeing 747. At this time, the 747 is the biggest passenger aircraft in the world, and it had a very unique look to it. Even people that didn't care about aircrafts or they didn't know anything about airplanes, they knew that this is a 747. Because it was such a revolutionary aircraft, a lot of airliners wanted to buy it. But there was so much demand that Boeing couldn't fulfill all of them immediately. But the main airliners got it. The first airliner that got a 747 was Pan American. After that, airliners like KLM, Lufthansa, Iran Air, and Japan Airlines also received them. But in this video, we don't care about any other airliner, but the Japan airliner. At this time, Japan Airlines is the most important airliner of Japan, and it still remains to this day. At this time, Japan is going to the technological route, and they need a lot of 747 just for domestic purposes. That's why their order did not have first class or business class. It was only economy seatings. This means you can fit way too many people compared to any other 747. Another order the Japanese gave to Boeing is that their fuel tank should be smaller, so it has much more room for cargo. And it also makes the plane lighter. Just like we said, these 747s were only going to be used inside of Japan, so no more than an hour of flight time. With the help of all these modifications, the Japanese could fit more than 550 passengers in a 747. But the Japanese aren't new to something like this. Have you seen their country? Their parking lots, their hotels. Every square inch is being used and there's no free spots. So it makes sense that their airplanes look like this as well. A regular 747 has 366 people sitting in it, not more than 550. Time passes, these Japanese 747s go around the country day in and night out, until we get to the year 1985. One 747 that was owned by Japan Airlines goes to take off and hits the bottom end of it on the runway. This usually happens because the pilot lifts off too early and it underestimates the weight, so the rear end smashes into the ground rather than take off. When this happens, the rear end of the aircraft gets heavily damaged, and when it lands, it has to be repaired. But the Japanese didn't have enough time to completely change their rear end. So, simple way to put it is that they hacked the fixing. They put it together properly, but that's not how you're supposed to do it on a 747 that took damage to a rear end. They basically left it as a weak spot. It's like changing a fender on a car without fixing the framing of it. Maybe the framing could be smashed up and that has to be fixed. And if it's not, it's going to create a weak spot, and that's a huge problem, especially for a plane. This 747 that was just fixed goes back to work and keeps working without a problem. But the ticking time bomb continues to count down. These 747s are being heavily used, so there's a lot of tension on the body panels of these 747s compared to the other ones. When you keep lifting off and landing, you're putting a lot more pressure on this aircraft than any other plane that goes on long distances. They continue to use this aircraft with the cancer growing in the rear end until the 12th of August 1985. The time is 5 p.m. in Tokyo, and the same 747 that had been previously repaired is filling up 520 passengers to go to Osaka, and it will only take 1 hour. After they put all the cargo and the passengers in the aircraft, it was 6 o'clock and the 747 takes off. The main captain is Masami Takahama, the assistant is Yutaka Sakaki, and the engineer is Hiroshi Fukuda. When the aircraft takes off, it continues flying for 12 minutes and it only goes to 24,000 feet because it was only going to Osaka. less than an hour away now. But you have to know, the rear end of this plane has a huge problem. It's like putting a band-aid on an infected wound. You could say 12 minutes after takeoff, the rear end of the 747 tears apart. In the beginning, the captain thought the landing gear had exploded because there was no easy way to look if there's a rear end or not. The captain contacts the control tower and tells them there is an issue and we have to perform an emergency landing. The captain is told to go towards east and land in the nearby airport in Oshima. The communication between them is also recorded. But it seems like all the hydraulics are not working. It's like driving a car with no steering wheel. And they realized that the rear end had exploded where all the hydraulic controls are located in. So nothing works, which means you cannot turn anymore. The 747 can only go straight. When you have no control over your hydraulics, that's when the nose starts to go downwards, and that means the airplane is about to free fall. But the captain knew what he was doing. He kept playing with the accelerator or the throttle and kept bringing the nose up and then letting it fall down so they can continue going straight, so they can figure something out. It was one of the worst experiences you could imagine because the aircraft is uncontrollable. You only have an accelerator to help you with. And worst of all, the aircraft is running out of oxygen because when the rear end of this 747 tore apart, it actually punctured the hole, or the interior pressure of the aircraft went out, and that means there's no oxygen inside the cabin. When this takes place, the oxygen mask could help, but it's still not enough. So inside the cockpit of this aircraft, the pilots are keeping this afloat, and they're also suffocating from a lack of oxygen. Even though they're suffocating while doing all this, they keep contacting with the control tower to ask for help and see if there's anything they can do. The biggest problem ahead of this 747 is that Japan is a very mountainous country, and there is no flat land where an airplane like this can land easily. What you're hearing is the sound of the cabin at that time. The sound cut off. Japan Airlines 123 at 6:56 p.m. on August 12, 1985, crashed into the mountain near Tokyo. The amount of passengers and crew inside the 747 was 524 people. All of them were killed except for 4 people. This disaster is the deadliest aircraft disaster in history, but the one that involves one plane, because the deadliest aircraft incident in history involves 2 747s, which we've made a video on previously. We've always heard that the Japanese are extremely organized and they do everything properly, but unfortunately, this 747 that was used on flight 123 wasn't properly put together and it wasn't inspected enough, so something like this could be prevented. But it's not the Japanese airline's fault, because a problem like this has happened in China. In the year 2003, one of the aircrafts of China Airlines does the same thing and hits the rear end of a 747 on the runway, damaging it. Just like some of the other airliners, they didn't properly fix the rear end so it can go back to work. The same airplane later on lifts off from Hong Kong and the rear end explodes and it dives straight into the sea next to Hong Kong, and 225 passengers and crew members die.